Chapter 12 talks about the world of government relations, which we'll explore briefly in this lecture. It's probably one of the more complicated endeavors of public relations, just because government, by nature, is a very complicated system. And this, in turn, is a good example of why public relations is so important, is because government is an extremely complicated maze to navigate, whether it be at the federal or state level, or dealing with government organizations. Nothing is ever easy. So public relations playing the role in that is pretty important, to be able to communicate from the government to the public how things are done, and using public relations to gauge public opinion. It's Even though government does not use the term public relations, I think the chapter talks about terms such as public affairs and information officers. Public relations isn't, the word itself isn't used to describe communication activities within government, but the same principles that apply to public relations in any type of organization do apply to within government as well. And it makes sense that there would be a need for public relations in government. Politicians are like any organization or a business. They need publicity. They need to be able to get their name in the newspaper and in the media and in front of the public in order to be elected or reelected, in order to help get support for policies. Government agencies need to have a direct line with the public to help get programs supported. So we oftentimes think, as your average citizen, that there isn't a lot of work done from the government in communicating to the public, and sometimes when it's done, it's not done very well, but it's there, and it's evident at every level, from the local level to the federal, national level, president, and so forth. So the book talks about a few different areas where public relations is evident within the government, and goes into some of the history of it and how things have changed over time, and especially now because government has become so big and pervasive in our lives, and that likely isn't going to change despite efforts from some new political groups of doing so. It's going to be there, so that public relations support will always be important. Two of the most prominent departments that utilize public relations are the State Department, and that's been true for a while. And the State Department, obviously, with its international outreach, has kind of a global spread as far as its public relations outreach. Department of Defense is a huge one, and it's kind of startling when you look there at the amount of the budget within the Department of Defense that goes towards communications. You figure that within every branch of the military, there's a different public affairs component that includes newspapers and magazines. Like the book talks about, for instance, the need for more public relations, since military recruitment has gone to a voluntary. Well, that's a lot different than when it was mandatory, so there needs to be solid communications in place to support those recruitment efforts, especially during a time of war, when perhaps joining the military, people can certainly see the downsides to it. And like any public relations, it has to be honest. It has to be forthright. It has to be genuine, and that's going to make those type of actions will make public relations, will make an organization of any type succeed, and that's certainly true for government, where it's struggling on a daily basis to gain the public trust. I like the discussion about, the most interesting part of this chapter for me was talking about the role of public relations and the president, and going back to at least Reagan and talking about the communication styles of the different presidents and how important that communication style was to the perception and public support for the various candidates. Of course, Reagan was the great communicator. It helped that he had an acting background, which I think played a role in terms of his comfort in front of the podium or in front of a camera. But certainly he was one of the great communicators in terms of presidents. He was followed by the first George Bush, who was not as comfortable in front of the camera and was not as elegant of a spokesperson as Reagan was. President Clinton didn't have the elegance of Reagan, but he had a very formal gosh shucks approach that tend to resonate well. Good friends with the media. He appeared genuine and thoughtful on camera, and that his approach, that personal approach, probably won him a number of votes that he would have lost during times when he actually lied on camera. Talking about the Monica Lewinsky affair and other things that were certainly impacted his presidency, but he managed to pull through in terms of charisma and personality. The second George Bush certainly had his high moments and low moments in terms of communications. Right after 9/11, probably his most, his stellar moments as a president of his the speech that he gave via Bullhorn at the remains of the World Trade Center, just very very good stuff. He didn't have, a lot of people remember the second George Bush of his public speaking gaffes, of which there were many in terms of vocabulary and so forth. But he did have some stellar moments there early on, and I think later on he suffered because of some PR style events that did not go very well. To include the mission accomplished on the battleship, and then of course communications during Hurricane Katrina. And then President Obama has done quite well as a communicator, some way similar to Clinton, very friendly, very charismatic, and that's helped him a lot in terms of support during some pretty trying times in our nation. So proper public relations and communications certainly plays a role for the commander-in-chief. And you can look over time at presidents and their communication styles and the impact it's had on the public perception of them. Key part to public relations within the office of the president is the president's press secretary, the spokesperson for the president, which probably has to be one of the most challenging public relations jobs that there is. Imagine having to go before almost hundreds of reporters, the Washington Press Corps, on a daily basis, to translate the message of the president to the media, and then out to the larger audience. And the audience that you're trying to reach is the American people. So that's a bit intimidating. You're complicating things that are not easily understood, that possibly sometimes you might not necessarily agree with. And that's a part too. The book briefly talks about that the press secretary, a good one, shouldn't just be the voice of the president, but if the president is saying things that's not going to resonate well with the public, that person needs to be able to work with them too. So it's a back and forth type of process. The person should be a trusted advisor along with the other advisors that the president has. But again, a very challenging job to take. And then when the questions start coming in from all over the place, from some of the best reporters in the country that make up the Washington Press Corps, you need to have a thick skin. The rest of the book then goes on to talk about lobbyists, and of course lobbyists tend to have a negative connotation to them because of some of the scandals in recent times in terms of lobbying. It does remain, though, a very important role in terms of government. Lobbyists act as advocates for different organizations and businesses to help that organization navigate the maze of Washington, D.C. to support a certain cause. Oftentimes there are backroom dealings. Oftentimes there are, shady endeavors that take place. But I think those tend to be not as frequent as the norm, which is just good, honest communications. The important section to focus on in this chapter, and this will help you with your government relations assignment, is on pages 258 to 259. It talks about do-it-yourself lobbying and how you, as a citizen, can work with your government, whether it be local, state, or federal, to advocate for the causes that you agree with. And the book on those 2 pages gives some good advice there. And same with how the chapter closes, talking about local government. Here in Alaska, we're pretty fortunate because even though, here in Fairbanks anyway, Juneau is quite a ways away from us, so our politicians feel somewhat removed. But, out of session, our interior delegation and our local politicians, we have access to them that's a lot of places would envy, to have. You can stop and talk to the mayor at Fred Meyer, if you know all our school board members, at a backyard picnic. And we see our state legislators and senators at hockey games and basketball games. Sometimes we have, kids who go to school together. So we are fortunate, though. Alaska is a huge state and quite spread out. We do have some pretty good access to those who make the decisions down in Juneau. So that's Chapter 12, Government Relations. A lot of different things to absorb in this chapter, but useful to know just in terms anyway of how things work on the government side of the house when it comes to what we'll call public affairs. So that closes this lecture, and good luck with the quiz.